now, I'd like to just talk a little bit about Jeff. He does not know this. I have known Jeff his entire life. He and my son, Ty, were very good friends all through school, classmates from kindergarten on. But I not only knew Jeff, but I knew his mother quite well. She was a very good friend, a couple years older. And not only her mother, his mother, but his grandparents were very good friends of my parents. And his great-grandfather were good friends of mine. They were all early settlers to the Culver area. And the thing that was interesting with Jeff is that his family and my family kept all of this history very much alive to us. So when I talk to Jeff, and we talk about people that we actually probably never knew because we weren't born yet, but all these names are familiar to us that are early settlers of Culver, going back to Houghton's and all of the others that we think of as the founding fathers of Culver. But the thing that's wonderful about Jeff is that he has continued to research the Culver history and to keep it alive. And not only that, remain a local resident. So he's one of the few people that I know that has contributed so much to keeping the history of Culver alive, not only by the history, but by living here himself his entire life. And I admire you, Jeff, for doing that. Thank you. And now he's going to talk about the last of these grand hotels that we had. We've heard a lot about all the Culver hotels around the lake, but these last two are two that have a very long history that I think a lot of you have never heard. Thanks, Jeff.
Wow. Well, thanks, Cheryl. Thank you. We have had some fantastic conversations, especially lately, but over the years as well, and absolutely a lot of deep memories of Cheryl's family and many other families. I'm going to try to project. I was in the back last time, and I know how hard it can be to hear. Hopefully Cheryl wasn't just really saying I've now become an artifact of Culver myself, as one does. But just I guess to kind of jump in the story, she and I were actually talking about program ideas, and these two last hotels that I would think a lot of folks in this room have some memory of, or know people who have some memory of. We still talk about them quite a bit, and they really are the last of a golden age, as the title implies. Oh, and before I forget, I'm just sitting right in front of me, since you haven't had enough announcements, but I'm also involved, and this is John, and I'll leave people out, but the library sponsored Stories and Stones Cemetery Walk. We had one a couple of years ago, obviously didn't last year with COVID. It's in September, I don't have the date right in front of me, September 18th to Saturday. What we're kind of looking for, we're each portraying a historical figure from the Culver area, where the library is hoping to have some volunteers that could kind of just help steward people through, because it can be like herding kittens, you know. So if you're interested in it, I'm going to put this packet here and loosen it. Oh, I'm going to throw that at you. Okay, thank you. And anyway, if anybody's interested, there's info on it. Or you can talk to the library, of course. All right, so just to kind of jump in, to give context to these last sort of giants that we're talking about, we really have to give context to the broader story. And I know, Cheryl and I kind of agreed I wasn't just going to do a talk on hotels, but I do have to do a whirlwind spin through hotels to give a sense of what we really saw the last tip of, if you will. Really, the oldest of these predates the railroad, which is unusual, and it's still standing, which is actually really unusual. And that's what was known by different names, the Allegheny House, the Spangler House. It's a hotel on 18B Road, today owned by Paul Cromley, and many of you may know this, but this is where Lew Wallace wrote part of Ben-Hur, and he's referenced in the Chicago American in 1905, talking about writing part of the novel Ben-Hur, which is the best-selling book in America after the Bible in the entire 19th century. It's a big hit. So anyway, he actually called Lake Maxinkuckee the most beautiful place in the world. You might think he hadn't gotten around much, but he actually was a Civil War general and an ambassador to Turkey, so that's high praise. What really kickstarts this whole thing is the coming of the railroad, right? So there's the old wooden depot, the original 1880s depot. The Vandalia Railroad reaches then Marmont. The town of Culver was Marmont at that time in 1883. When we talk about the Pioneer Rock, one of the names on it is McDonald. So Daniel McDonald and his friends ran a club. We'll talk about that in a second. Not ran a club, had a club. They lived in Plymouth, and they would come down in the muddy dirt roads, the horse and buggy, to Lake Maxinkuckee, and they wanted the railroad here. So they petitioned the Pennsylvania line, and we had the Vandalia Railroad running to Plymouth and eventually South Bend in 1883. Uh-oh. Back. Sorry. That's weird. Sorry about that. Just took a moment. Maybe. There we go. Well, it's fancy. Anyway, so what that brings, of course, is a tourist culture, right? Starting in the 1880s and really going to about the 19-teens, and they say 1915. Just to give you an idea, there's Lake Maxinkuckee, the old bathhouse, which is about where the beach lodge is today. You can just get a sense of, why would you come here? Well, you're in the city, it's hot, you want to put on your long black Victorian swimsuit and come up on the railroad to the cool breezes of Lake Maxinkuckee or any lake you could reach. There we are. You need a suit on and a tie, of course, but it's still better than the hot asphalt of Indianapolis. And you can just see the volume. We say there were about 5,000 to 7,000 people coming in any given summer weekend in Culver during these years. So what are you going to do with all these people, of course, is the question. And one of the things you do with them, again, the roads are mostly, they're dirt. I say mostly, they're all dirt, and they're pretty muddy, and you're taking a horse and buggy. So we have the Steamboat Pier, which is really the pier that's there by the lighthouse today. And it's sort of water taxis, right? You had the double-decker steamboats, the Aubanabi and the Swaggy. You had a variety of boats that I've done talks about that would take you to the different hotels or to the Academy later, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just to give you a sense of the scene. I hope I'm not blocking people here. A sense of the scene there. This is all in the park, right? The town park, and you can still walk that path. And there's the pier, and beautiful spot to come visit. This is the Lakeview Club. This is what Daniel McDonald and his friends erect. If those of you are familiar with that land between the campus of the Academy and the town, which we've always called the Indian Trails, it was part of the old Potawatomi Trail system. The highest bluff there was the home of the Lakeview Club, which again, this is really what begins the cottage culture, and then the hotel culture is these clubhouses. There's a Peru Club, there's a Rochester Club, there's an Indianapolis Club. You can imagine where these folks were from. Subtle naming conventions. There's the Lakeview from the front. I always find this fascinating growing up here, or even whether you did or not, if you walk these trails, and there's sort of this lower trail system that's rough, and when I was, as a kid, it was the Indiana Jones trail system, fall off a cliff, but look how manicured this was, right? If you walk that lower trail, there's still this kind of hump thing as you walk along going towards the Academy campus, and you can see how well kept the whole thing was if you were getting off onto the pier, going up to the Lakeview, which becomes a hotel, because in 1890 the club members sell the clubhouse to the Vandalia Railroad, and it becomes the Lakeview Hotel. So it's one of the earlier hotels. Again, you get a sense of the landscape in this old postcard going left, and then today's beach lodge, then the bathhouse, which was in those days wood, would be over there at the left. Another hotel that plays an important role in Culver's history is the Culver Park Assembly Chautauqua Hotel. So without going deeply into this, the Chautauqua, of course, Lake Chautauqua, New York, Methodist Revival Camp, edutainment before electricity, before movies. You could come here preaching, but also scientific demonstrations and opera, anything and everything. These popped up all over America. So Henry Harrison Culver, businessman from St. Louis, builds a big, beautiful wood frame hotel in 1889. And he does really well and brings 10,000 people here. Here's a photo of it. These little creek thing that's going to persist even after that building is used as the first barrack for Culver Military Academy in 1894. That's the whole school in 1894. Burns in early 1895 and is replaced with main barracks. So right where the main barracks sits is this building. There's main barrack. Still with the little creek in front of it. There used to be a lagoon system, etc. Just as a quick little, I'm looking for pictures of the Osborne Hotel, and I start, and then Culver-Union, I find these neat little tidbits. The town park. If you're in the town park, you see the hill going up towards the root beer stand. There were once these little cabins in the 1930s that were aimed at kind of bringing tourists into the town park. So getting us to, we're going to get to the Culver Inn in a moment, but just to situate you from the air, here's where the Culver Inn is going to be, this little peninsula here. It's not really a peninsula, it's a point. This is the Jungle Hotel, which was really a lodge with multiple smaller little buildings around it. I always like this picture because you see these 3 fish hatcheries that were adjacent to Culver Academy's campus. So again, if you're walking the Indian Trail to the campus, there's that little creek right at the edge of campus. That fed those ponds, which were filled in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. Well, they weren't all filled in. They stopped being fish hatcheries. There's the Jungle Hotel. The Jungle Hotel. I was going to try to get the date because I got ahead of my own story here. The Jungle Hotel is we don't know the exact date of being built, late 1800s. 40 rooms, 20 baths, southern pine logs, little cottages around it. I missed that. Sorry, click at me here. There we go. This was a neat brochure where the Indianapolis Star newspaper carriers could come spend the weekend at the Jungle Hotel. And I love the pictures because you get a sense of that walkway at the campus and how the hotel was situated at one point back in the day. So that's the Jungle. It's going to go down in the 1930s. It just deteriorates. Bayview is another hotel on the East Shore in that lower land, just supposed to be south of Perry's Point, that kind of low land. Was the Bayview Place Hotel. There it is in 1898. And there are a number of these, sort of rooming houses around the lake. That's a whole other story we don't need to get into, but, the Bioweed, the Maple Grove, there's one kind of in town. They're not really hotels proper, but they're sort of rooming houses to accommodate these thousands of people. Not that all of them stayed over, because they didn't, but they still needed a place to stay. Probably the most lavish of these in the golden age of tourism is the Colonnade. You can see, by the way, this little tree, that's our mulberry. It's still there in the town park. This is the late 1800s. The wooden train station was further towards the Indian Trails, towards the campus. That's east, I think that's through. Then the brick one of today. There's the Colonnade behind it. And the Colonnade was, there it is again, it goes back to 1885. It had a skating rink, had a fountain, an indoor fountain. It had telephone service eventually, which was a big deal, and the celebrities and actors of the day would come to the Colonnade. Local schools would have their graduation ceremonies in the Colonnade. It's going to suffer the same fate as a lot of hotels and burn down in 1900. By the way, you see this gingerbread thing. You still see those in the town park, right? Those are the old waiting stations for the old platforms where you would wait and get sheltered from the sun or rain while waiting for your train. And they've been since moved, but they're still there, dating back to the 1880s in the town park. This is also still there. It was a hotel, as you see, boarding, lodging. It was more of a restaurant and sort of entertainment center, but that's the Kreitzberger Park. Of course, longtime beloved member of the Antiquarian Board, Bob Kreitzberger, who passed away a few years ago, but his family from Logansport, that was really their kind of extension business from Logansport. And again, it's still there. Here it is in the 1970s, inside and out. It's been really beautifully maintained. There it is, on the west end of the park. I just have to throw this in. The old White Swan floating dance hall is pulled out in 1905 off the water and put behind what is today the movie theater and converted into the Pearl Street Apartments that we still see today in Culver. So it's very interesting. And we wondered about that and finally found newspaper confirmation of it, so that did happen. The Ralston Hotel, the entire south end of Culver, starting in 1899, was the Maxicunky Assembly Chautauqua. Mr. Culver Chautauqua had obviously gone away after a year or two, but this Chautauqua goes on really from Davis Street. Davis Street over there. all the way down, past where today's cemetery is, was the Maxinkuckee Park Assembly Grounds, and it was a pretty hot, hot property to be. A lot of train lines running to it, a lot of national publicity, and this was its hotel. And even after the Chautauqua shut down in 1907, I believe, it was 1907. This Ralston Hotel continues until it burns down in 1911. This might be a familiar name, Chadwick's, right? If you're on Long Point, there were two prominent hotels on Long Point. Chadwick is one of them, built in 1886 on the north shore of Long Point. The hotel falls into disuse, sold in 1918. It actually stays standing and gets kind of retooled and renovated. By the way, some of you might know of this or remember it. 1954, Camp Maxinkuckee, which was a summer camp for girls, opened up there for just a handful of years in what was left of the old Chadwick Hotel. But the Chadwick Shores townhouses were built at that site in 1988. Of course, the old hotel is gone by then. The original Arlington Hotel was on the south end of Long Point, or south part of Long Point, built also in 1896. It burned soon after, rebuilt, closed in 1912, and in 1917 a chimney fire caused enough damage to cause it to go away. So, as we get ready to jump into the two we're really going to focus on, what happened? Well, besides the fact they all tended to burn, like everything did, half the Academy did, this is the big change, right? You've got this sort of captive audience of people coming up on the railroad from all points south almost in Indiana, and particularly, I don't know how many of you know this, south of Indianapolis, there really aren't natural lakes. There are creeks and rivers, but the lakes that are down there, including the largest one in Indiana now, which is Monroe, they're all man-made. So the topography is such that we get the lakes because we got the glacier, they get the cool caves and hills, so it's a trade-off. But they're not coming on the train as a captive audience to populate these hotels, and everybody's getting cars. The roads, by 1915, most of the roads are becoming paved. Certainly the streets of Culver are paved. People have got it. You probably can't read, but it says, "You auto be in Culver, Indiana." It says on the old postcard. And this is a 1914, I believe, article from the Culver Citizen about road improvements. So that's a common. That's going to be the story, right? Technology drives so many of these changes. So the days of the railroad are really coming to an end, and the steamboats end up dry docked and rotting by 1915. And of course, the other factor is electricity, right? You don't have to come to a lake to cool off anymore. Here we are still using a fan, in fact, to cool off in the summer in Culver. So, anybody recognize this building? I'm sure some of you do. Like me, you've seen the picture a million times. But this is the Palmer House, okay? So this is going to become the Culver Inn. The Palmer House dates back to 1875, at least. It was run by J.W. Palmer of Plymouth, who ran it for several years. A little interesting because it predates the railroad as a hotel. This picture obviously looks like it's from the 1920s. But at the time, this is not a Culver Academies operation as it's going to be. I think most of us think of it as being tightly associated with the Academy, and it really isn't initially. It's on its own land. Here are several old pictures and postcards from the 1890s and early 1900s of the Palmer House. So again, this is the Culver Inn. It's the same building as what will become the Culver Inn. Not to, put anybody out, but how many of you remember the Culver Inn personally? Yeah, like almost everybody. Yeah, so a lot of us remember the Culver Inn. This is David Braden. He's the first cadet to enroll at Culver Military Academy in the summer of 1894. Actually, neat thing, I guess I haven't mentioned, I think most of you know this, I am the Museum and Archives Manager for Culver Academies, and his great-great, I can't remember, nephew, grandson, something, sent us his picture and his original cap and his medals, and his really a neat find. So this is David Braden. He's an important guy because in 1912, he's, by the way, class of 1896, he graduates in 1896 from Culver. He opens the toggery shop, initially in the basement of South Barrack, if you know the campus, and eventually he gets moved to the Palmer House. And as part of his retail operations, he opens a little candy area called the Candy Shack. And then he adds a soda fountain, And I jumped ahead of myself, but he adds a soda fountain, and that's going to become the Shack. So those of you, a lot of you probably remember going to the Shack with the pine paneling that's added in the 1930s. We'll get back to that. And we just, on campus, kind of recreated the Shack, and that is the original pine paneling when you go in there that someone saved when they tore down the old building, which we'll get to. This is a landmark moment. The Culver family is beginning to buy up land around what was then the campus and kind of expand. And this is all leading towards what will become 1932 and 33, the shift to a nonprofit organization rather than a private business owned by the Culver family. So they're adding land, and one of the pieces of land they buy, by the way, one of them is the Indian Trails, which includes the Lakeview Hotel. And in 1929, that burns down. So they buy it like within a year of it burning down. So that's kind of a bum deal. But you know, but the other purchase you see here in June of 1928, Palmer House and Land sold to E.R. and B.B. Culver family. Yes, and it's incorporated in 1932. It's incorporated in the newly incorporated Culver Educational Foundation. And that same year of 1932, it has a new name, not the Culver Inn yet, the Maxinkuckee Inn. So for several years, it's going to be the Maxinkuckee Inn. They immediately begin remodeling and adding on, including new motel rooms and accommodations, 7-foot picture window that we kind of, a lot of us will remember, and of course the shack is then, their fireplace is added. The shack is then wood paneled and gives it the look in 1932 that we think of today. There's some pictures, and I'd be remiss not to mention the most famous, face of the Shack. George Steinbrenner said she was the best-looking gal on campus when he was attending Culver Academy. That's Mary Baker, and she started working 44 or 49. Now my brain, but she worked for decades until retiring in the 2000s. Of course, she's passed away since then, but Mary Baker was synonymous with the Shack, and there she is in the picture. So the Maxinkuckee Inn, there are annexes, so additional buildings added, including North Lodge, which is going to be torn down, and another becomes West Lodge. So West Lodge is used in the 60s, some of you in this room remember that, for accommodations for students, particularly I think late 60s band, the band unit was in it, and it's going to become early girls' housing for students at originally Culver Academy for Girls, which opens in 1971, 50 years ago this fall. And of course, in 1975, its name changes to Culver. It was originally Culver Academy for Girls, changes to Culver Girls Academy. And so that's one of their early dorms, which is going to be renamed Linden Hall in 1977. It's torn down in 1999, and the current Linden erected. But that was originally an annex to the Culver Inn, that structure. These are neat photos I found somewhat recently on the State Historical Society website, just to that walkway in front of what was the inn and kind of what it was like to walk the path that we all probably know as, we're now looking from where the wrought iron sort of fence is and the curve. If you haven't walked the campus, you can now along the lakeshore. COVID protocols are down, so if you haven't walked that beautiful walk along the campus, you should do that. It's you'll not only see the site of the inn, which is now just the Shack is what's there, but it's just a beautiful walk if you haven't done it. 1954, the Maxinkuckee Inn changes names to the Culver Inn, and that's again where most of us will remember it as the Culver Inn. And it's not only is it a hotel that accommodates visitors to the Academy, but and others, but it's also it has a fine dining. Really, it was the fine dining. I think you could safely say for much of its time. It had not only the Shack, which is sort of a burger kind of joint, right? But also the more fine dining restaurant space. And this year's Barb Meeker's painting that a lot of us remember, watercolor of the. She took some of the last pictures of the inn. Those are pictures she took to do her painting, and she let us have those. But there's the restaurant, which later is going to be renamed the Payson Room for Colonel Payson, who was the longtime band director at Culver Academies. But for a lot of reasons, by the late 80s, the shack vacates before this. In 1984-85, they're doing extensive remodeling on the dining hall at Culver, the 1911 dining hall. It's still there, and they build the student center underneath, and they open a new shack, and in the lay center underneath, named for Word Lay. But the old shack's already gone. The inn sort of was still there in some capacity, but by '91, it's torn down. It's really deteriorated. You could debate, we should it have been renovated and kept, whatever. But sadly, one of the last of those, kind of golden age of hotels goes away. Technically, the last in the sense that the next one we're going to talk about actually goes down first. But that kind of leads us to Osborne. This is actually W.O. Osborne or Will Osborne, but the story really begins more with his father, John Osborne. He's born in 1859 in Stark County. He moves in 1879 to Union Township here. He's active in various pursuits. A lot of business stuff, right? This whole block over here is the Osborne Block. My talk about ancestors. My great-grandparents had the flat above Cafe Max and what was then, later comes the Clothiers. It's the Clothiers, not later. It's the Clothiers. There was a movie theater that Osborne ran in what is today part of Cafe Max, and my great aunt sold peanuts to pay her way through nursing school in the movie. My grandmother played piano there, so this was all John Osborne stuff. He did quite a lot of this kind of thing around Culver, and of course his son is one of the giants. I mean, we could have a whole program on the Osborne family, but certainly Will Osborne, W.O. Osborne, Culver High School graduate, and even as a student, he's making some money selling, I think he was selling oats to the horses that students had tied up at the post. So he's going to become the president of the State Exchange Bank. Again, my grandmother's a secretary when the bank is robbed in 1933 over here. So this bank, he runs, and it becomes one of the most successful banks in Indiana, which was robbed twice. That's another good story if you don't know it. The Academy, leadership, Colonel Rosso, and local police tracked down the robbers and caught them. But W.O. is successful enough that, renowned enough, I guess you could say, that IBM International has him come be their keynote speaker in 1949, and executives from IBM come and tour the bank soon after that here in Culver. So really a prominent guy. He's also an attorney. He's the Culver Academy attorney and a trustee. Just really a giant of Culver. And I'm off on his story, even though that's getting ahead of the story. But so to talk about the Osborne Hotel is at least to some extent talk about the school. Culver's second schoolhouse, as far as we know, was built in 1868, and it's right up there at Ohio. It stretches, but closer really to Washington Street. But what is today Ohio Street wasn't there, so that's school land. This is actually a picture of students in the old school. The old school, by the way, is not going to be torn down completely when the Osborne Hotel takes over. I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story. It's actually pulled from an article John Houghton wrote in the Culver Citizen for this information. The old school is actually kept for years, and it changes hands several times after the Osborne Hotel is built at the site. It's made into a private home. Then it becomes it's a store owned by the Hand family at the southwest corner of Main and Jefferson, where the Antiquarian Historical Society Heritage Park is today. It's finally torn down in 1926, but the Citizen says there's still plenty of use in the old oak frame. But this was the old schoolhouse. So I also found kind of an interesting. There's an article here. This is 1906. We're going to build a new school. There's 1903 sketch painting of what the school is going to look like. And I just thought this was interesting. It is needless to speak of the humiliation which every resident of the town has for years felt when contemplating the present tumble-down concerns, the school, in which the youth have been housed. It is unsafe, unsanitary, and unsightly. It's subtle. In this commonwealth of exceptionally fine educational facilities, it is impossible to regard with patience the disreputable building which has been so long tolerated in Culver. Very few small towns country have such a host of intelligent, well-to-do visitors as are constantly drawn to Culver by the Academy of the Lake. These people have viewed our school building with amazement and contempt. Wow. Hopefully no one thinks the colorful decor, never mind. Anyway, sorry, I'm just stopping. But today, anyway, so yes, we're happy to get a new school. I think that's safe to say. I mean, it's interesting how bad it must have looked, because, and then it gets used for several years more. This is 1906. And in 1907, January 1907, the school property's been sold to Henry Ezekiel for $1,325, and John Osborne is going to buy it, and he's going to erect a new hotel. And it says in the citizen, the cement blocks will be manufactured on the spot. That's interesting. And what we get out of that is the Grand Osborne Hotel. It's a 3-story structure, 88 by 34 feet, 36 bedrooms, a veranda 10 feet wide and 100 feet long on the side of the building. I remember that, especially as a kid. Maybe some of you do as well, that porch, that wraparound porch with the wall that was fun to walk on. The first floor had an office, a waiting room, dining room, 30 by 28 feet, that could hold 75 people. So it's also kind of a civic center in its way, not that it's the only one, but you could host events in it. Second floor had 16 rooms, lavatories and toilets, and the third floor had 17 rooms, lavatories, and toilets. So it celebrates its opening in 1908 with a banquet for about 30 businessmen and their wives, with Mr. and Mrs. John Osborne as host and hostess. It's one of the best equipped hotels in northern Indiana. We always said that, about any hotel that we had here. So you can just see the steam heat's $2. It's a good deal. Check out Airbnb, see if you can get a comparable deal today. In 1909, John Osborne added to the livery facilities of the Osborne Hotel a new 2-cylinder, 22 horsepower automobile. It's a handsome car. W.O. Osborne, remember him, ran the hotel dray service, picking up guests and luggage at the Vandalia Depot and registering guests in the hotel. I assume that's the car back there, the Osborne Mobile. Keep people up. This is a fun old postcard of you looking east from the Osborne Hotel. So if you're in your hotel room... what was the address? I'm jumping ahead, but I will add that if you go on the Antiquarian website, the old phone books are there, and it's still in there in 1984. And the address is it's an Ohio Street address, or was it? I think it faced Ohio, not Jefferson, as far as address purposes. Is that?
Well, Ohio still didn't exist, even after the hotel was built.
True. So
it had an Ohio address.
it had an Ohio address. Okay.
And Miss Goss, who up here at the funeral home,
Yep.
she gave piano lessons in that hotel, and I remember going in there and taking piano lessons.
There you go. Okay, so it had an Ohio Street. Yeah, because it was right at, and I'll get to its specific location if you don't know in just a moment. But it's there at the corner of Ohio. But you're right, there was no Ohio Street at the time, and then there really weren't
any street addresses.
There weren't street addresses either, right? You would say, if you had a street name, you'd say it was on that street, so and so's house. But there weren't numbers at that time. Hotel dances. This was a reference in 1919. The manager of the Hotel Culver, now they were calling it the Hotel Culver, announced for next Friday night dances to be given at the hotel. Good music, gentlemen's tickets 75 cents, ladies free. So in 1920, it's for sale, and we're going to see this trend, particularly if you remember the story that 1915-ish is when this sort of age of tourism ends. So this is going to be a problem for any hotel that hasn't burned down. You could almost say the misfortune of not having burned down, because you have to do something with this big building, and what do you do? So it's going to change hands over and over again. In 1920, 42 rooms, furnace, steam heat, electric lights, sold by John Eisenbarger of North Manchester. Joe Stewart of Roanoke, Indiana, buys it, but in December it's sold to George Shively. He's a hotel man from Winona who's going to take possession 23. But by that April, it's purchased by N.J. Hackett of North Judson. It becomes the Hotel Hackett. Then it's sold to W.H. Eichenberry of Kokomo. This is all within the span of like 3 years. So you can kind of get a feel for what's happening. 1926, this is probably the most hopeful article. Mr. Scott of Rockford, Illinois installs hot and cold. He's the new buyer, installs hot and cold running water in 18 rooms, private baths in 6 more. Electric wiring has already been installed, right? Because it probably didn't have that. $1,500 of up-to-the-minute furniture. The place was in the throes of despondency, according to the Citizen. So that's the throes of despondency. By the way, there's a rumor about, certainly celebrities did stay, I'm sure, when they came to town, as they did in different hotels. One of them in particular that keeps getting referenced is Will Rogers. Will Rogers' son was at the Academy in the 1920s. He could have stayed. He was a special guest at the Academy, as you might imagine, several times, and was on their radio station, WCMA. We know he stayed on the campus, which would make sense, but not going to say he didn't stay in the Osborne Hotel, but we all know Will Rogers, the humorist and movie star. Hopefully, maybe we don't. But anyway, and the name that sticks with it for a while is the New Culver Hotel. As of 1928. Again, it's just going to keep changing management. I wrote it down, but it's just going to be a list of names as it changes management. This is fun. This is a 1937 film. I hope it works. It won't be fun if it doesn't. Oh, come on. Well, it's trying. This is one of those questions with PowerPoint. Is it going to embed my film or is it not? Shake the dice. Or I'm going to guess it's not. We may try again in a little bit. Oh, I completely froze it. Yeah. Oh, wait, hopefully. Come on. I had a thought. Okay, we're going to do this. Sorry, everyone. It just doesn't look hopeful. Well, there was a film shot of the hotel in 1937. I mean, it just looks like the pictures, but it's fun because it's an old film. That'd be a fun program sometime. I think many of us have seen it. Maybe you haven't. The fire department in Culver shot a black and white silent film of the whole town and the area in 1937. And I think it's interesting they use it as a fundraiser because film was, seeing a movie was so rare of your town. So, you could go see the movie of yourself walking outside the post office or something in 1937 and pay a nickel and they got a new, fire hose or something. So, anyway, it's a neat film, 1937. It's got a lot of neat scenery. But there's the old hotel in the 70s, more as 60s or 70s, more as I remember it. You see the big stoplight, we had traffic under control in those days in Culver. There was one of 2 stoplights, as some of you remember, and those were crazy days. The decorated peaks that have been on top of it, we think were taken off in the 1940s. If you look at the old pictures, it's gone by the time many of us remember it. It has a little brief gasp of new life, right? In 1974, there's a project. John, you were much closer to this at the time because there's a lot of reporting about it. The Osborne Center, W.O. Osborne is really in his latter years for sure. He's going to die, let's see, it'd be about 8 years later. But the town is honoring him, but also going to really take the hotel and make good use of it as a senior center, kind of a civic center. So the idea of the Osborne Center takes off in 74. It had a dedication in 75, but it really doesn't happen, right? Nothing comes of it, and you just sort of peters out. There's really nothing more said about it, and it just sits there. I should have not have jumped ahead because now you know the end of the story, but I think we all knew it anyway. It sits there and into the 80s, through the 80s. I think those of us who were around remember there was someone kind of occupying it who sort of lived out of his car. It was empty and just kind of sitting there. So it really had to go, I think, by unless somebody really could have renovated, but by 1991 or 1990 actually. So right at the same time ish as the Culver Inn, it goes down. It's torn down. So the last 2 really of those really memorable grand hotels, and of course, what's there today? Not this, but for many years, the the farmer's market in Culver was located at this lot. So right across from CVS to the north, I mean, you could see it out the window if we were a little higher. You know, is this vacant lot where the Osborne Hotel sat in its heyday. So, you know, obviously I think we look back and we think of kind of with some nostalgia about those good old days, but it's also interesting to think about, to think about the, you know, kind of the rise of tourism again in Culver in the last decade. It's not quite the same, obviously, but Culver has once again become hot. And I was just kind of grabbing pictures to illustrate this, and I went on to VRBO just to get sort of a graphic of, you know, so many rentals, right? Weekend rentals, and now it's not so much the big hotels, which are pretty tough to manage, right? What's the biggest challenge? Nobody's in them between, you know, between October, maybe September and May. So, you know, what do you do with this big building? So a lot of condos or particularly, of course, weekend rentals of homes. But what I thought was interesting is as I'm searching for Culver at VRBO, this little thing pops up that says, Culver is popular. Culver will always have that. But it's true, and I think that speaks to this kind of like coming full circle in a certain sense of Culver as a destination, like Mexico is a destination, Culver Academies is a destination. So those hotels are gone, but in a certain sense, you know, the kind of culture that created them, it's also gone, but there's a new sort of way of that existing. So before I put you all completely to sleep, I will, that's what I had. Does anybody have questions on, that I can pretend I know the answer to?
It's not a question, but a remark about the theater. It's called the Home Theater.
Oh, yeah.
And my mom always talked about your relative playing the piano.
Yep.
And the owner coming out and enticing all of the small children walking home from school to come in and see the trailer, so to speak, of the silent movie. And then they would stop it right at a very exciting point. And say, now go home and tell your mom and dad you need however much it was to come back and see the movie.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that operated into the late 30s. You had both, you know, the theater over on Lakeshore and then the home theater. It was the north, I think it was the north section of Cafe Max, the old Cafe Max was the theater. And yeah, sold peanuts and popcorn, and they lived upstairs. And my great-grandfather was H.L. Werner, who was a watchmaker whose shop was upstairs, a jeweler and watchmaker. So that was what they were doing there.
In the early 80s, there was a bunch of us called, my father Jeff used to stay with the Chicago ghetto people, and we would stay at the Osborne Hotel. Well, the first floor, you know, had nice tables and everything, and they had up and down, and then all the way down there where it was kind of a senior living. I don't know if you remember that, but people lived on the first floor, older people, and that was their home, and a brother and sister owned it. And so, if we wanted to spend a lot of money, we could get, there's several of us here, Dave. Masons and.
If you wanted a bath, I think you'd take that one.
If you wanted a bath attached to your room, it was $2 more, and if you wanted an air conditioning unit in the window, 50 cents a night, which none of us did. But if we really wanted to save money, we go to the third floor, and there was 2 water closets up there for the 17 room.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So I don't know if you remember, the Solons had a lot of kids, and Espositos had a lot of kids, so they could go up there and run around, because if you're on the second floor, you can let the kids get out of the bed, because they're asleep.
Oh, yeah.
So the guys would go down and go up low and play bridge.
Okay, sure.
They had some tables, and then the guys would slowly disappear, and we started hearing them coming back early. Oh, there's a corner tap, just which has become like things, you know, gone now.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's interesting. So yeah, there were people good point. People were living in it in some of its last days, that's right, yeah. I do kind of remember that now you say that. Interesting. Anybody else? Well, some of you do have memories of it. All right, any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned Colonnade. Where was that located?
So about where, we agree on this, it's about where Bennett's, Colonnade, where was the Colonnade located? About where Bennett's Plumbing and Heating, that strip, Culver Coffee, you know, that area, across Lake Shore, which is then Toner Avenue. Yeah, and in that case, the longtime proprietor took the money and ran shortly before it burned down. So that was kind of a scandal. Yeah.
There's a large cottage on the East Shore. I don't know who owns it right now, but it was owned by, I think it was built originally by Tom Osborne. Is that the same Osborne?
Related, yeah. They're all Osborne seed. I mean, there's a long spread of, and I'd almost have to get out my genealogy charts to see who's what. But yeah, there's a lot of Osborne spread. But yes, the cottage that eventually Tom Spies had, and today it's a Zeglis cottage. Yep. Really interesting place. But yes, all the Osborne folks. Yep.
W had a cottage on the.
Good. Yes. Right. Yeah. W.O.'s cottage. I meant to mention that when I was talking about him. It just was torn down within the last couple of years, but it was up on the hill above the Ball Cottage, Ball State, Ball Jars. You know. So it was the limestone built, I think, at 49, if I have that right. But it was up on the hill, kind of across from the tennis courts. You know, it just was replaced. What, you need someone?
What's very major interview for her memories of, dating from the 40s on that?
She was to some extent. I mean, there were some stories done about her when she retired, and she kind of was out of the picture when I got involved doing history there. She would have been a great one to sit down and video. She was everybody's mom and grandmother, you know.
West Lodge was the original home of the girls' summer school. In 1965, the girls lived in West Lodge, and the first floor was deck 1, and the second floor was deck 2. They were called decks because Mary Frances England had been in the Navy.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, I don't know if everybody heard that, but yeah, good point. Before the Culver Academy for Girls opens in '71, really the predecessor to that, if you will, or you know what kind of launched the first girls program was the Summer School for Girls in 1965, and West Lodge, that annex, was the first dormitory, if you will. And I don't know if you heard that, but yes, Mary Frances England, who is the founding dean of Culver Girls Academy, or Culver Academy for Girls, was in the Navy during World War II as a wave.
So one of the advantages was that West Lodge had ensuite bathrooms. So they had,
I lived there.
but I did too. Yeah.
In 1965, I was in the girls' school, and I came back in 1967 as a junior counselor.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. It's a lot of history in that building. You know, it's.
So that was just upper school at that time, right?
There was no woodcraft. There was no woodcraft.
So when did girls come to Woodcraft?
77.
77.
And if you know Janet Klein, she might even be here. She was the first girls woodcraft director.